Sometimes grief takes you to places you never meant to go, and sometimes what follows you changes everything. Tom Jessup was 64, riding into the Mojave alone with his wife's ashes. He planned to scatter them where their story began, then ride back in silence. But a dusty donkey had other plans. Mile after mile, the stubborn creature followed through scorching heat, refusing to leave no matter how often Tom chased it away. Days passed, and the donkey's quiet companionship began cracking something deep inside Tom's heart. Then, at a desert spring, he saw it, a faint, heart-shaped brand behind the donkey's ear. The same symbol his wife used at her rescue ranch. What was this animal doing here? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks before Tom Jessup rode into the Mojave Desert with his wife's ashes, he stood in the doorway of an empty barn and wondered if he'd ever feel whole again. The ranch sat in Nevada's high desert, 20 miles outside of Tonopah, where the land stretched flat and golden under an endless sky. It wasn't much to look at: 200 acres of scrub brush and alkali flats, a weathered house that had needed painting for a decade, and a barn that had seen better days. But it had been home for 40 years, and until 6 months ago, it had been filled with purpose. Tom was 64, though he felt older most days now. His face was creased and weathered from a lifetime under the sun, his hands calloused and scarred from decades of ranch work. He stood just under 6 feet, with a wiry build that spoke of a man who'd spent his life working rather than sitting. His hair had gone silver years ago, and he kept it short beneath the battered Stetson he'd worn since his 30s. His eyes were grey-blue, the color of distant mountains, and these days they carried a weight that hadn't been there before. Sarah had died on a Tuesday in March, lung cancer, though she'd never smoked a day in her life. The doctor said sometimes it just happened that way: bad luck, wrong place, wrong exposure to something years ago that finally caught up. They'd found it too late, stage 4, already in her bones and liver. She'd lasted 8 months from diagnosis to the end, and Tom had watched the woman he loved fade a little more each day until there was almost nothing left but her spirit and her smile. The smile had lasted longest. Even at the end, when the pain medication kept her floating in and out of consciousness, she'd managed to smile when he took her hand. They'd met at a spring in the Mojave 40 years ago, both of them young and full of promise. Tom had been 24, working as a ranch hand for a cattle operation near Baker. Sarah had been 22, working her family's small horse ranch closer to Las Vegas. They'd both ridden out to the same remote spring on the same August evening, arriving within minutes of each other as the sun painted the desert gold and crimson. Tom could still see her as she'd been that day, climbing down from her paint mare with easy confidence, her dark hair braided down her back, her eyes bright with curiosity, and something else he'd only later understood was recognition. They'd talked for hours that evening, sitting on the rocks beside the spring as the stars emerged and the desert cooled around them. By the time they'd parted, both knew something significant had happened. They'd married a year later, bought this ranch with their combined savings, and built a life together that had been simple and good. They'd never had children, Sarah couldn't, a fact she'd discovered early and mourned privately, but they'd filled their days with work and each other, and eventually with the animals. The rescue ranch had been Sarah's dream. 20 years ago, she'd brought home a starving horse someone had abandoned on the highway, and that had been the beginning. Word spread that Sarah Jessup would take in any animal that needed help, and over the years they'd housed dozens of horses, mules, donkeys, dogs, and the occasional goat or sheep. Sarah had a gift with damaged creatures. She could gentle the wildest horse, coax trust from the most frightened dog. She worked with patience and kindness, never rushing, never forcing, just offering safety and care until the animal was ready to accept it. Tom had supported her work, helped with the heavy lifting and the fence repairs and the endless task of keeping everything running, but it had been Sarah's passion, Sarah's calling. The animals had loved her, followed her around the property like she was the sun they orbited. She'd marked each one with a small heart-shaped brand on their left ear, her signature, her promise that they'd been saved and loved and would always have value. After she died, Tom had kept things going for a month, going through the motions of feeding and watering and mucking stalls, but his heart wasn't in it. Without Sarah, the rescue felt hollow, pointless. The animals sensed the difference. They were cared for but not cherished, and Tom knew it wasn't fair to them. So he'd made the calls, contacted the sanctuaries and rescue organizations Sarah had worked with over the years. One by one, he'd said goodbye to the animals, watched them load into trailers bound for new homes where people with Sarah's gift would care for them properly. It had taken 2 months to place them: all 3 horses, 2 elderly mules, 4 donkeys of various sizes, 6 dogs, and a temperamental goat named Clarence, who'd outlasted everyone's expectations. By May, the barn was empty. The corrals stood vacant, the feed room gathered dust. Tom had walked through it all one final time, seeing Sarah's handwriting on the stall cards, smelling the lingering scent of hay and leather and animals, and feeling the absence like a physical ache in Biddy. His chest. He'd kept only one thing, the copper urn that held Sarah's ashes, stored on the fireplace mantel where he could see it every morning when he came downstairs. Sarah had been specific about what she wanted: no funeral, no service, no grave. She wanted her ashes scattered at the spring where they'd met, returned to the place where their story had begun. Tom had promised her he would, holding her hand in the hospital bed 3 days before she died, his throat too tight to speak, but his nod enough to make her smile one last time. But 6 months had passed, and Tom still hadn't made the journey. He told himself he was waiting for the right time, the right weather, the right frame of mind. The truth was, he couldn't face it. Scattering her ashes felt too final, too much like admitting she was truly gone. As long as the urn sat on the mantel, he could pretend she might walk back through the door at any moment, asking what he wanted for dinner or telling him about a new animal that needed help. The house felt enormous without her. They'd lived simply 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a living room with the stone fireplace Tom had built himself 30 years ago. Sarah had decorated it with things she loved. Old photographs in mismatched frames, a quilt her grandmother had made draped over the couch, books stacked on every flat surface. She'd read voraciously, everything from ranch management guides to poetry to thick historical novels she'd discuss with him over dinner, even though Tom rarely read anything beyond the newspaper. Now the house felt like a museum to a life that no longer existed. Tom had changed nothing, moved nothing, as if preserving everything exactly as Sarah had left it might somehow bring her back. Her reading glasses still sat on the side table next to her chair. Her jacket still hung by the door. The calendar in the kitchen was still turned to March, the last month she'd been home. Tom knew he was stuck. His neighbors knew it too. Martha Henderson from the next ranch over had stopped by twice in the past month, bringing casseroles and concern. She'd sat at the kitchen table with Tom, drinking coffee and talking carefully about grief and healing and the importance of moving forward. Tom had nodded and thanked her and eaten the casseroles, but he hadn't moved forward. He'd barely moved at all. He spent his days doing small tasks that needed doing, fixing a fence post, organizing the tool shed, cleaning the truck. But they were just ways to fill time, to avoid thinking, to stay busy enough that he didn't have to feel the enormous emptiness where Sarah used to be. He went to bed, exhausted, and woke up exhausted, and the days blurred together into a grey sameness that would have horrified Sarah if she could see it. It was Martha who'd finally pushed him. On her last visit, she'd sat across from him and spoken plainly. "Tom, you're dying too, just slower. Sarah wouldn't want this for you. You know she wouldn't." He'd wanted to argue, but he couldn't. She would have hated seeing him like this, hollow, going through motions, existing but not really living. That night, Tom had taken down the leather-bound photo album from the shelf. Sarah had kept it faithfully, adding pictures over the years: their wedding day, various ranches they'd worked, animals they'd saved, quiet moments captured on film. He'd sat at the kitchen table and turned the pages slowly, remembering each moment, each phase of their lives together. Near the back, he'd found a picture of them at the spring, taken on their 20th anniversary when they'd returned to the spot where they'd met. They were both smiling, Tom's arm around Sarah's shoulders, the desert sunset glowing behind them. Sarah had written beneath it in her careful handwriting, "Where it all began, where our hearts first knew." Tom had stared at that photo for an hour, and something had shifted inside him. Sarah had asked him to scatter her ashes at that spring. She'd been clear about it, specific, and he'd promised. 6 months was long enough to avoid that promise. It was time to honor it, time to give her what she'd asked for, time to say goodbye properly. The next morning, he'd begun preparing for the journey. The spring was 3 days' ride into the Mojave, accessible only by horse or on foot. He'd need supplies, water, bedroll, provisions for himself and his horse. He worked methodically, making lists, checking gear, planning the route he'd ridden dozens of times over the years. He'd told no one of his plans. Martha would have insisted on coming with him or sending someone to accompany him, and Tom needed to do this alone. It was his grief, his goodbye, his journey to complete. He packed carefully enough water for 3 days out and 3 days back, dried food, coffee, medical supplies, maps, though he knew the route by heart. He prepared his horse, Copper, a 15-year-old bay gelding who'd been with them for a decade. Copper was steady and reliable, the kind of horse who wouldn't spook at shadows or complain about long days. The morning Tom left, he rose before dawn. He'd loaded Copper the night before, double-checked every strap and buckle. The copper urn fit securely in his saddlebag, wrapped in a soft cloth. He'd also packed the photo album, unable to leave it behind, wanting Sarah's face close even in this final journey. He stood in the kitchen one last time, looking around at the home they'd built together. The emptiness pressed in on him, but underneath it was something else, now a kind of determined resolution. He was doing what Sarah had asked. He was keeping his promise. Maybe after this he could figure out how to keep living. Tom locked the door, mounted Copper, and turned the horse toward the desert as the sun began to paint the eastern sky with light. The barn stood empty behind him. The corrals were quiet. The land stretched endlessly ahead. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture he'd always made when leaving on a journey, and urged Copper forward. He had no idea that 3 days into that journey he'd encounter a dusty donkey that would change everything. He had no idea that Sarah's gift to him hadn't ended with her death, that she'd planned for this moment with a love that reached beyond the grave. He only knew he had a promise to keep, and 3 days of desert between him and the keeping of it. Behind him, the ranch grew smaller in the distance. Ahead, the Mojave waited vast and ancient and holding secrets Tom didn't yet understand. Tom rode into the Mojave at first light, watching the desert come alive with color as the sun crested the distant mountains. The temperature was still bearable at this hour, the air carrying the sharp, clean scent of creosote and sage. By noon it would be brutal, the kind of heat that made mirages dance on the horizon and turned shadows into precious commodities. But for now, the riding was good. Copper moved with steady purpose beneath him, an easy gait that could eat up miles without strain. Tom had ridden this route many times over the years, enough to know every landmark, every reliable water source, every place to make camp. The spring where he'd first met Sarah was roughly 70 miles southeast, deeper into the desert than most people had any reason to go. It would take 3 days at a careful pace, allowing for rest and the heat of midday. The landscape spread out in all directions, flat expanses broken by rocky outcrops and distant buttes, the earth ranging from pale sand to rust-red soil. Scattered vegetation dotted the terrain. Joshua trees with their strange, twisted arms, clumps of sage and rabbit brush, the occasional mesquite surviving in a dry wash. The sky was already turning that fierce, cloudless blue that promised no relief from the sun. Tom let his mind wander as Copper walked, the rhythm of the horse's movement, meditative and familiar. He thought about Sarah, as he'd been thinking about her constantly for 6 months. Specific memories came unbidden, Her laugh when he'd accidentally dyed all their laundry pink by washing a red shirt with the whites. The way she'd lean against him on cold mornings, stealing his warmth. How she'd sing off-key while working with the animals, not caring who heard. He found himself talking to the urn in his saddlebag, speaking aloud thoughts he'd kept locked inside. "Remember that time we got caught in the flash flood out near Barstow? You laughed the whole way home, soaked to the bone. Said it was the most fun you'd had in years." His voice sounded strange in the empty desert, but there was no one to hear, no one to judge. The first day passed quietly. Tom stopped at midday to rest, Copper in the shade of a rock formation, rationing water carefully for both of them. He ate jerky and hardtack without tasting it, his mind far away. In the afternoon, he passed a dried riverbed he and Sarah had explored once, finding ancient pottery shards they'd carefully left in place, respecting the history embedded in this land. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Tom made camp in a protected hollow between two rock ridges. He unsaddled Copper, rubbed the horse down, and set up his bedroll. A small fire provided light and comfort as the desert cooled quickly with sunset. Tom heated coffee, the bitter smell mixing with the smoke, and sat watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. "First day done," he said to the urn, which he'd placed on a flat rock near the fire. "2 more to go. I'm keeping my promise, Sarah." "I am." He slept poorly, as he had every night since she died, waking frequently to stare at unfamiliar stars and feel the weight of solitude pressing down. But he woke before dawn, packed his camp with practiced efficiency, and continued south and east as the sun rose behind him. The morning started like the first, Copper moving steadily, the desert awakening around them, Tom lost in memory and conversation with someone who couldn't answer. But around mid-morning, something caught his attention, a small cloud of dust on the back trail, perhaps a mile behind. Tom stopped Copper and turned in the saddle, shading his eyes against the glare. Another traveler, maybe. The desert wasn't completely empty, though it was rare to see anyone this far from main routes. Tom watched for a few minutes, but the dust cloud didn't seem to be gaining or falling back, just maintaining distance. Odd, but not alarming. He turned Copper forward and continued on. By midday, the dust cloud was still there. Tom had stopped twice to check, and each time, whatever was following had stopped too, staying roughly the same distance back. Now, curiosity mixed with mild concern. If someone was following him deliberately, why not catch up? If they weren't following, why maintain that exact distance? Tom made camp earlier than planned that afternoon, choosing a spot with good visibility in all directions. He wanted to see who or what was trailing him. He unsaddled Copper, set up his bedroll, and built a fire, all while watching the back trail. It was nearly sunset when he finally saw it clearly, a small grey-brown figure moving steadily through the sage, not a horse, not a person on foot. Something smaller, 4-legged, plodding along with what looked like stubborn determination. A donkey, a damned donkey, was following him across the desert. Tom stood, hands on his hips, watching the animal approach. It stopped about 50 yards from his camp, standing perfectly still, as if waiting for permission to come closer. Even from this distance, Tom could see it was scruffy and dust-covered, with long ears and a thick barrel body typical of its breed. "Hey!" Tom shouted, waving his hat. "Get out of here! Go on!" The donkey didn't move, just stood there, watching him with what seemed like infinite patience. Tom picked up a small rock and threw it in the donkey's direction, deliberately aiming to miss, but hoping to scare it off. The donkey backed up a few steps, then stopped again, still watching. "I don't need company," Tom called out, hearing the frustration in his own voice. "Go find whoever you belong to. Go home." The donkey stayed put. After a few more minutes of this standoff, it lowered its head and began cropping at the sparse desert grass, apparently settling in for the evening just beyond the edge of Tom's camp. Tom turned back to his fire, irritated and confused. Where had this animal come from? There were no ranches or settlements within 20 miles in any direction. Had it escaped from someone? Been abandoned? The desert was no place for a domestic animal to be wandering alone. It would die of thirst or heat within a few days. He tried to ignore it through dinner, heating beans and making coffee, but he kept glancing over at the donkey. It had moved slightly closer, maybe 40 yards away now, and had settled onto the ground with its legs tucked beneath it, watching the fire with apparent interest. Tom noticed details in the fading light. The animal was wearing a halter with a frayed lead rope still attached, dragging on the ground. Someone had owned this donkey, cared for it enough to halter train it. The animal didn't look starved or mistreated, just dusty and tired. "It's not my problem," Tom said aloud, trying to convince himself. But Sarah's voice echoed in his memory. "Every creature deserves kindness." He sighed, stood up, and walked to his water supply. He poured water into his hat. The brim was wide enough to serve as a makeshift trough, and walked halfway toward the donkey, setting the hat on the ground. "Here," he called, "drink if you need to, then go on your way." He returned to his fire. After a few minutes, the donkey stood and walked cautiously to the hat, sniffed it, then drank, deeply. When it finished, it looked directly at Tom, and he could have sworn there was gratitude in those large brown eyes. The donkey didn't leave. As darkness fell completely and the stars emerged in their thousands, the animal remained near the camp, a darker shadow against the dark desert. Tom went to sleep troubled, aware of the presence just beyond his firelight, wondering what the morning would bring. He woke once in the night to see the donkey closer now, maybe 20 yards away, lying down with its head up, watching over the camp like a self-appointed guardian. The sight stirred something in Tom's chest, an emotion he couldn't quite name, part annoyance, part reluctant affection, part deeper recognition of something he wasn't ready to acknowledge. When dawn broke on the third morning, Tom packed his camp with the donkey, watching from its spot nearby. He mounted Copper and turned to look at the animal one last time. "I'm heading deeper into the desert," he said, feeling foolish for talking to a donkey. "You should turn back, find water, find people, don't follow me," he urged Copper forward. After 100 yards, he looked back. The donkey was following, maintaining that same careful distance, ears forward, steps purposeful and steady. Tom felt his jaw tighten. He had a promise to keep, a journey to complete, and no patience for complications. But the donkey kept coming, and as the sun climbed higher and the heat began to build, Tom found himself glancing back more frequently, checking on the stubborn creature that had decided, for reasons he couldn't fathom, to follow a grieving man across one of the harshest landscapes on earth. The morning of the third day brought heat that shimmered off the rocks before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. Tom had given up trying to discourage the donkey. It simply followed, patient and persistent, maintaining its distance like a devoted shadow that refused to be shaken. Tom found himself irritated by his liver's own concern. Every hour or so, he'd look back to make sure the animal was still there, still moving, not collapsed from heat or exhaustion. Each time, the donkey was exactly where it should be, following steadily, ears swiveling to track sounds, picking its way carefully through the rough terrain. By mid-morning, Tom's irritation had shifted into something closer to resigned acceptance. The donkey was coming whether he liked it or not. Fighting that fact only wasted energy neither of them could spare. The landscape had grown harsher as they pushed deeper into the Mojave. The soil here was lighter, almost white in places, crusted with alkali that crunched under Copper's hooves. Rocky outcrops rose like ancient sentinels, their faces carved and pitted by wind and time. Vegetation was sparse, scattered creosote bushes, the occasional barrel cactus, not much else. Water would be scarce until they reached the spring tomorrow. Around noon, when the heat was at its worst, Tom stopped in. The shade of a massive boulder to rest Copper. He dismounted, loosened the saddle cinch, and pulled out his canteen. As he drank, he watched the donkey approach, stopping about 30 feet away in a patch of shade. The animal's sides were heaving slightly from exertion, its coat dark with sweat under the dust. It had to be thirsty. Tom had given it water last night, but that was nearly 16 hours ago, and they'd covered a lot of ground in growing heat. Tom looked at his water supplies. He'd packed carefully, calculating what he and Copper would need for 6 days with a safety margin. He hadn't calculated for a donkey. Sharing water meant potentially running short on the return journey, meant taking a risk he hadn't planned for. He looked at the donkey again. Its eyes were half closed against the sun, its stance patient but weary. Sarah's voice came to him unbidden. Every creature deserves kindness. You can't turn away from suffering just because it's inconvenient. Tom sighed, pulled out his hat, and poured a careful measure of water into it. He walked toward the donkey, which raised its head with interest, but didn't move. Tom set the hat on the ground halfway between them and stepped back. "Come on," he said quietly. "I know you're thirsty." The donkey waited a moment, as if assessing his sincerity, then walked forward and drank deeply. Tom watched, noting how the animal drank carefully, not gulping, taking what it needed but not wasting a drop. Someone had trained this donkey well, taught it desert survival. When the hat was empty, the donkey raised its head and looked directly at Tom. For the first time, he really studied the animal. It was small for a donkey, probably a jenny rather than a jack, with a thick grey-brown coat and a slightly lighter muzzle. The halter was worn leather, good quality but old, and the frayed lead rope suggested the animal had broken free from somewhere. "Where's your person?" Tom asked, knowing he'd get no answer, but needing to voice the question. "Why are you out here alone?" The donkey's ears swiveled forward, focused entirely on him, as if trying to understand the words. Tom found himself moving closer, reaching out slowly. The donkey didn't flinch, allowing him to touch its dusty neck. The coat was rough under his palm, and he could feel the solid warmth of the animal's body, the strong heartbeat beneath the skin. "You remind me of someone," Tom said softly, memory stirring. "Sarah rescued a donkey years ago. Came to us half-starved, covered in wounds from being beaten. She spent months gentling that one, earning its trust." He paused, remembering. "Used to follow her everywhere, just like you're following me." The donkey leaned slightly into his touch, a gesture of trust that caught Tom off guard. Something in his chest tightened, an emotion he'd been carefully avoiding for months, something that felt dangerously close to connection. He pulled his hand back and returned to Copper, unsettled by his own reaction. This was just a stray animal, probably lost, certainly not his responsibility. After he scattered Sarah's ashes tomorrow, he'd head back to civilization and report the donkey to animal control. Someone would collect it, find its owner, or a new home. That was the sensible plan. But as he tightened Copper's cinch and prepared to move on, Tom found himself talking to the donkey again. "You can keep following if you want, but I'm not making any promises. This isn't a rescue mission." The donkey's response was to fall in behind Copper as soon as Tom mounted, maintaining that same careful distance, but staying close enough that Tom could hear its hoofbeats on the hard ground. They traveled through the afternoon, Tom lost in thought. He'd been alone with his grief for so long, carefully maintaining distance from everyone who tried to help. Martha and the other neighbors meant well, but their sympathy felt like pressure, like expectations he couldn't meet. They wanted him to be okay, to move on, to heal on their timeline, but the donkey asked nothing of him. It just followed, silent and steady, requiring only occasional water and seeming content with whatever attention Tom chose to give. There was something profoundly peaceful about that simple companionship. As the sun began its descent toward evening, Tom started looking for a place to camp. He found a good spot in a shallow canyon where the rock walls would provide some protection from wind. A dead juniper tree offered firewood, and the sandy floor was relatively level. He unsaddled Copper and set up camp with practiced efficiency, building a small fire as the light faded. The donkey settled nearby, closer tonight than before, maybe 15 yards from the fire. Tom heated beans and made coffee, and on impulse he opened a second can of beans and scraped half into his tin plate. He walked over to the donkey and set the plate on the ground. "Figured you could use something besides." "Brush and dried grass." The donkey ate gratefully, and Tom stood watching, surprised by how satisfying it felt to provide for another living thing. He'd spent 6 months in isolation, caring for nothing, barely caring for himself. This simple act of feeding a stray animal stirred something he'd thought was dead. When he returned to his fire, Tom pulled out the leather-bound photo album. He'd been carrying it in his saddlebag, but he'd been reluctant to open it, afraid of the emotions it might unleash. Tonight, with the donkey's quiet presence nearby and the vast desert around him, he felt ready. He turned pages slowly in the firelight, pausing at photographs that captured moments from his life with Sarah. Their wedding day, both so young and hopeful. The ranch, in its early years, before the rescue work began. Sarah, with various animals over the decades, her smile constant, her love for every creature evident in how she held them, looked at them. Near the middle of the album, a recipe card fell out, fluttering to the ground. Tom picked it up, recognizing Sarah's handwriting immediately. It was her peach cobbler recipe, written in her careful script, with a note at the bottom, "Love is patient." Tom stared at those 3 words, feeling them resonate in his chest. Sarah had been patient with him, with every damaged animal she'd helped, with life itself. She'd understood that healing couldn't be rushed, that trust had to be earned slowly, that some wounds needed time and gentleness to mend. He looked over at the donkey, which had settled down for the night, its eyes reflecting the firelight. Maybe that's what this unexpected companionship was, Sarah's patience reaching across death, reminding him that healing was possible, that connection didn't have to be complicated, that sometimes the simplest kindness mattered most. Tom tucked the recipe card carefully back into the album. He added wood to the fire and sat watching the flames dance, feeling less alone than he had in months. Tomorrow he would reach the spring. Tomorrow he would scatter Sarah's ashes and say his goodbye. But tonight he had a fire, a donkey, and the first stirrings of something that might eventually become peace. "I think I'll call you Dusty," he said softly to the donkey. "If you're going to stick around, might as well have a name." The donkey's ears flicked in his direction, and Tom smiled for the first time in longer than he could remember. Tom woke on the 4th morning to find Dusty sleeping closer to the camp than before, maybe 10 feet from where his bedroll lay. The donkey must have moved during the night, seeking the warmth of the dying fire, or perhaps just the comfort of proximity. Tom studied the animal in the grey pre-dawn light, noting the peaceful way it rested, legs tucked beneath its body, head drooping in sleep. Something had shifted inside him. He'd left the ranch 3 days ago, determined to complete this journey alone, to face his grief in solitude, to say goodbye to Sarah without witnesses or complications. But Dusty's presence had changed things in ways he was only beginning to understand. The companionship was undemanding, the connection uncomplicated. The donkey asked nothing except occasional water and acceptance. In return, it offered steady presence, patient understanding, and a reason to care about something beyond his own pain. As Tom stirred, Dusty raised her head and looked at him with those large, intelligent eyes. Tom realized he'd been thinking of the donkey as her since last night, some instinct telling him the animal was female. He nodded to her, as he would to any companion greeting the day. "Morning, Dusty." The donkey stood and stretched, shaking dust from her coat, then walked to the edge of camp and waited as Tom prepared for the day's ride. He shared his breakfast jerky with her, pleased by how carefully she took the offering from his palm, her lips soft and gentle. As Tom saddled Copper, he found himself talking to Dusty the way he used to talk to Sarah, explaining his thoughts, sharing memories, voicing questions he didn't expect answered. It felt natural, comfortable, like having a conversation with an old friend who was content to listen without judgment or advice. "Today's the day," he said, tightening Copper's cinch. "We'll reach the spring by afternoon. That's where Sarah and I met, 40 years ago." He paused, emotion catching in his throat. "I've been putting this off for 6 months, but I can't avoid it anymore. I made her a promise." Dusty watched him with what seemed like understanding, and Tom felt grateful for her presence. The thought of reaching the spring alone had been weighing on him since he'd started this journey. Having a witness, even a four-legged one, made the task feel less isolating. They set out as the sun crested the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and rose. The landscape here was familiar to Tom. He and Sarah had ridden this route on their anniversary trips, always returning to the place where their story began. Every rock formation triggered a memory. Every bend in the trail held echoes of conversations long past. Tom told Dusty about Sarah, the words flowing more easily than they had when he'd tried talking to human friends. He described their first meeting at the spring, how young and nervous he'd been, how Sarah's confidence had drawn him in. He talked about their wedding, the early years of building the ranch, the quiet rhythms of their life together. "We never had children," he said, hearing the old sadness in his voice. Sarah couldn't. She found out when she was 25, some complication from a childhood illness. It broke her heart for a while. He paused, remembering those difficult months. But she poured all that love into the animals instead. Every rescue was like saving a child to her. She gave them all her heart. Dusty plodded along behind Copper, her presence a comfort, her patient, listening somehow, making it easier to speak truths Tom had kept locked inside. Around midday, as they stopped to rest in the shade of a rock overhang, Tom dug through his saddlebag, looking for the map he'd packed. His hand closed on something unexpected, a small, hard object wrapped in cloth. He pulled it out, curious, and unwrapped it slowly. Sarah's compass. Her grandfather's compass, the one she'd carried on every trail ride, every camping trip, every journey into the backcountry. The brass case was worn smooth from decades of handling, the glass crystal scratched but still clear. Tom opened it, watching the needle swing and settle, pointing true north with mechanical certainty. He hadn't packed this. He was absolutely certain of that, which meant Sarah must have hidden it in his gear before she died, knowing he would find it when he needed it most. Tom's hands trembled as he held the compass, feeling the weight of her love, her foresight, her determination to care for him, even after she was gone. She'd been weak those last days, could barely lift her arms, but she'd found the strength to hide this in his belongings, a gift to guide him when he finally made this journey. The tears came hard and fast, breaking through the dam he'd carefully maintained for months. Tom sat down heavily on a rock, the compass clutched in his fist, and wept for Sarah, for their life together, for the future they'd never have, for the unbearable ache of missing someone who'd been his entire world. Dusty walked over and stood beside him, close enough that he could feel her warmth, her solid presence. Tom reached out blindly and wrapped his arm around the donkey's neck, burying his face in her dusty coat, and she stood perfectly still, patient and steady, while he finally, fully grieved. When the storm passed, Tom sat back and wiped his face with shaking hands. He felt emptied out but also strangely cleaner, as if crying had washed away some of the accumulated weight he'd been carrying. Dusty hadn't moved, hadn't pulled away, had simply been there, a living anchor in the midst of his breaking. "Thank you," Tom whispered, stroking her neck. "Thank you for being here." He tucked the compass carefully into his shirt pocket, right over his heart, where he could feel it against his skin. Sarah had known he would need guidance, need something tangible to hold on to. She'd thought of him until the very end, had tried to prepare him for the hardest parts of the journey ahead. The afternoon ride continued through canyon country, the red and gold rock formations rising around them like ancient cathedrals. Tom kept one hand on the compass in his pocket, drawing strength from the connection it represented. He talked more to Dusty, sharing memories he hadn't spoken aloud in years, funny moments, tender ones, the small daily details that made up a life of love. As the sun began its descent, dark clouds gathered on the western horizon. Tom watched them with experienced eyes, recognizing the signs of a desert storm building. They would reach the spring before the rain came, but not by much. The first drops began falling as they crested a final rise and saw the spring below, a green oasis in the tawny desert, cottonwood trees marking the water source, rock formations providing shelter on three sides. Tom's heart clenched at the sight. He'd been here dozens of times, but never like this, never carrying Sarah's ashes, never preparing to say the final goodbye. Rain came harder, sudden and cold, and Tom urged Copper down the slope toward the shelter of the trees. Dusty followed close, her hooves sure on the wet rocks. By the time they reached the spring's edge, the storm was in full force, rare desert rain drumming on the rocks, turning the dust to mud, filling the air with the scent of wet earth and sage. Tom quickly set up his tarp between two trees, creating a shelter large enough for himself and the animals. He unsaddled Copper and rubbed both horse and donkey down, then sat beneath the tarp, watching the rain transform the desert around them. Dusty settled beside him, close enough that their bodies touched, sharing warmth in the sudden chill. Tom stroked her neck absently, his mind on the task awaiting him tomorrow. The rain felt like tears from heaven, as if the desert itself was weeping for Sarah, preparing for the moment when her ashes would return to this sacred place. "Sarah would have liked you," Tom said softly to Dusty. "She had a way with animals, especially the ones that needed patience and understanding. You've got that same gentle spirit." The storm raged for an hour before softening to a steady drizzle, then stopping altogether as night fell. Stars emerged between breaking clouds, brilliant against the washed-clean sky. Tom fed Dusty from his supplies and made a simple dinner for himself, but mostly he sat in the darkness, feeling Sarah's presence in this place where their love had begun, preparing himself for the morning when he would have to let her go. The fifth morning dawned clear and brilliant, the storm having washed the air clean and left the desert temporarily transformed. Puddles dotted the ground, reflecting the brightening sky, and the vegetation seemed greener, more alive. Tom woke feeling both rested and anxious, knowing today he would finally complete the task he'd been avoiding for half a year. He lay in his bedroll watching Dusty, who was already awake and grazing on the fresh grass that grew near the spring. In the clean morning light, Tom could see details he'd missed before: the way she moved, with careful precision, the intelligence in her eyes, the overall sense that this was an animal who'd been well loved and well trained. As Tom stood and stretched, preparing breakfast, Dusty walked over to him. He scratched behind her ears absently while waiting for his coffee to boil, and that's when he noticed it, a faded piece of fabric tied around Dusty's neck, partially hidden beneath her thick mane. Tom pushed the mane aside and saw a bandana, once red but now sun-bleached to a dusty pink. His breath caught. The bandana was tied in a specific knot, a slip knot that could be easily loosened or tightened, practical for an animal that might need adjusting as it grew or lost weight. It was the exact knot Sarah always used. Tom's hands shook slightly as he untied the bandana and spread it out. The fabric was worn thin in places, frayed at the edges, clearly old. It could have come from anywhere, been tied by anyone. Red bandanas were common in ranch country, but something about it felt familiar in a way Tom couldn't quite articulate. The size, the way it had been tied, even the degree of fading. He turned it over in his hands, looking for any identifying marks, but found nothing. Still, his heart was racing. "Where did you get this?" he asked Dusty, who watched him with calm eyes. "Who put this on you?" "The donkey, of course." Couldn't answer. But Tom's mind was working now, pulling at threads of memory. He tried to remember if they'd had a donkey at the rescue that wore a red bandana. Sarah had often tied bandanas on the animals. It made them easier to identify at a distance, helped visitors tell them apart. Different animals got different colors, but red had been Sarah's personal favorite. She'd worn red bandanas herself, tied around her neck or her head when working in the sun. Tom studied Dusty more carefully now, looking for other clues about her origins. The halter was good quality leather, well oiled despite its age. The frayed lead rope suggested the donkey had broken free from somewhere, but when and where? The animal was healthy, well fed, clearly someone's valued companion. So why was she alone in the desert? "Did you know Sarah?" Tom asked, feeling foolish for asking but unable to stop himself. "Did she tie this on you?" At Sarah's name, Dusty's ears perked forward with definite interest. It could have been coincidence. The donkey might just be responding to Tom's tone of voice. But it felt like more than that, like recognition. Tom's coffee boiled over, forgotten in his distraction. He cursed mildly and moved the pot off the fire, but his attention remained on Dusty and the bandana. He tried to remember the final days of closing down the rescue, the chaos of finding homes for all the animals while dealing with his grief. Had there been a donkey he'd overlooked? Had he been so lost in pain that he'd missed something important? He pulled out his phone to call the sanctuary that had taken the last of the animals, then remembered there was no cell service out here. He was miles from the nearest tower, completely isolated. The question would have to wait until he returned to civilization, but the mystery gnawed at him. Tom spent the morning examining every detail of Dusty's appearance and behavior. She responded to simple commands: stop, come, stay, suggesting someone had trained her well. She had no fear of humans, no signs of abuse or neglect. Her hooves were recently trimmed, her coat beneath the dust was healthy and glossy. Someone had been caring for this animal. And recently, around midday, as Tom prepared a simple lunch, he tried different words, watching for Dusty's reactions. When he said, "Sarah," her ears came forward. When he said, "ranch," she shifted her weight with apparent interest. When he said, "home," she made a soft sound low in her throat, not quite a bray, more like a questioning murmur. "You're someone's donkey," Tom said with certainty. "Someone who knows how Sarah trained animals, someone who uses her knots, her methods." He paused, a thought occurring to him. "Someone who knew I was making this journey." The idea seemed far-fetched even as he voiced it. Who would know? He'd told no one his plans. He'd left the ranch alone, not mentioned to any neighbor where he was going or why. It should have been impossible for anyone to predict his route or his timing, unless Sarah had told them before she died, unless someone who'd been close to Sarah in her final days knew about the spring, about Tom's promise, about the journey he would eventually have to make. Someone who'd kept Dusty safe and healthy until the right moment, then somehow arranged for the donkey to find Tom in the desert. It sounded like the plot of a movie, too convenient, too orchestrated. But Tom had learned over 40 years with Sarah that she was a planner, someone who thought ahead, who tried to care for the people and animals she loved, even when she couldn't be there herself. She'd hidden the compass. What else might she have arranged? Tom examined the bandana again, this time looking at the hem. They're so faded, he'd almost missed it, were initials embroidered in thread that had once been white, but was now yellowed with age. The stitching was crude, the kind of work someone would do by hand, not professionally. Tom traced the letters. With his finger, S.J., Sarah Jessup. Tom's vision blurred with tears. This was Sarah's bandana, one she'd worn herself and then given to an animal she loved. He remembered her sitting on the porch in the evenings, hand-stitching initials into her things, bandanas, handkerchiefs, the corners of quilts. She'd said it was old-fashioned, but she liked the personal touch, the way it made things truly hers. "She did know you," Tom whispered to Dusty, his voice breaking. "You were one of hers, one she saved. But which one, and when? And how had Dusty ended up here, in this exact place, at this exact time?" Tom spent the afternoon at the spring, trying to solve the puzzle, while preparing himself emotionally for the task ahead. Tomorrow was when he'd originally planned to scatter the ashes, but he found himself wanting to wait one more day, to understand more about Dusty's presence before completing his goodbye. As evening fell, Tom sat by the water's edge with Dusty beside him. He held the bandana in one hand and Sarah's compass in the other, two tangible connections to his wife, two pieces of the mystery she'd left behind. "I don't understand what's happening," he said aloud, "but I know Sarah had something to do with this. I know she sent you to me somehow. I just wish I knew why and how and what it all means." Dusty leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture of pure affection and trust. Tom wrapped his arm around her neck and sat watching the stars emerge, feeling Sarah's presence more strongly than he had since the day she died, wondering what other secrets and gifts she'd left for him to discover. Tom woke on the 6th morning with purpose burning in his chest. He'd spent half the night lying awake, thinking about the bandana, about Sarah, about the impossible timing of Dusty's appearance. There had to be more clues, more pieces to this puzzle. Sarah had been deliberate about everything, especially in her final months. If she'd arranged for this donkey to find him, she would have left evidence, a way for him to understand. In the grey, pre-dawn light, Tom examined every inch of Dusty's halter and gear. The halter was old leather, good quality, with brass fittings that had tarnished with age and use. The lead rope, though frayed, showed the same careful maintenance. Someone had cared for this equipment, kept it functional even as it aged. Tom's fingers found a small ring on the side of the halter where a lead could be attached. Something was threaded through it, something he'd somehow overlooked in his earlier examinations. He worked it free carefully, a small brass bell, tarnished green in places but still intact. The bell made a soft, sweet chime as he held it up to the growing light. He turned it slowly, examining every angle, and there on the curved surface he found what he was looking for, an engraving, worn but still legible. A single word in careful script, hope. Tom's legs went weak. He sat down hard on the ground, the bell clutched in his shaking hand, memory flooding back with such force it felt like being struck. Hope. Sarah's last rescue, the one she'd brought home 3 months before her diagnosis. Tom had been so busy with ranch work that spring, dealing with a problem fence line and a sick horse, that he'd barely paid attention when Sarah appeared with a young donkey in distress. She'd found it abandoned by the highway, severely underweight, covered in sores from an ill-fitting harness, terrified of human touch. Sarah had named her Hope because, she'd said, the animal represented hope for better treatment, hope for healing, hope that cruelty could be overcome with kindness. She'd spent countless hours with that donkey, slowly earning its trust, treating its wounds, building its strength back up. Tom remembered walking past the barn and hearing Sarah singing to Hope, her voice gentle and patient as she brushed the animal's coat or offered treats from her palm. And then Sarah had gotten sick, and everything else had faded into the background. Tom's entire world had narrowed to doctor appointments and treatment schedules, and the slow, terrible process of watching his wife die. He couldn't remember what had happened to Hope in the chaos, couldn't remember if she'd been among the animals he'd rehomed, or if something else had been arranged. But standing before him now, wearing Sarah's bandana and Sarah's bell, was a healthy, well-cared-for donkey who responded to Sarah's name and followed Tom through the desert, with determination that seemed almost purposeful. Hope, Tom said aloud, testing the name. The donkey's ears came forward immediately, her eyes brightening with unmistakable recognition. It's you, isn't it? You're Sarah's Hope. The donkey Hope walked forward and pressed her forehead against Tom's chest, a gesture he suddenly remembered seeing her do with Sarah. It was her way of asking for affection, of showing trust. Tom wrapped his arms around Hope's neck and held on, crying again, overwhelmed by the realization that Sarah's last rescue, her final act of compassion before illness claimed her attention, was here with him now. But questions still remained. What had happened to Hope after Sarah died? Tom had supervised the rehoming of every animal he could account for, but he'd been operating in a fog of grief, going through motions, barely functional. Had Hope been among those animals? Or had something else been arranged, something he'd missed or forgotten? Tom examined the bell again, looking for other markings. On the back, he found another engraving, newer and in different script. For the journey, M. Who was M? Tom ran through everyone he knew, everyone Sarah had worked with. Martha Henderson next door, but no, Martha hadn't been involved with the rescue operation. Michael Torres, no, that was Maria's husband who'd passed away years ago. Maria Torres, Sarah's best friend, her partner in running the rescue, the person she'd trusted most in the world besides Tom himself. Maria had been there through Sarah's illness, visiting when Tom couldn't bear to see anyone else, sitting with Sarah during the worst days, helping with decisions about the rescue animals when Tom was too overwhelmed to think clearly. Maria had cried at the funeral, had tried to talk to Tom afterward, but he'd shut everyone out in his grief, including her. Had Maria kept hope? Had she been caring for Sarah's last rescue all these months? And if so, how had hope ended up in the desert, following Tom's route to the spring? The sun was fully up now, warming the cool morning air. Tom stood and walked to the edge of the spring, Hope following close beside him. This place where he and Sarah had first met 40 years ago had become the center of a mystery he didn't fully understand, but was beginning to piece together. Sarah had known she was dying. She'd hidden the compass for him, had tried in countless ways to prepare him for life without her. What if she'd made arrangements with Maria about hope? What if they'd planned this together, Sarah, knowing Tom would eventually make this journey to scatter her ashes, Maria, knowing when and how to ensure hope was there to accompany him? It seemed impossible, too complex, too many variables that could go wrong. But Sarah had always been a planner, and Maria was smart and capable. If anyone could orchestrate something like this, it would be the two of them working together. Tom needed to know for certain. He pulled out his phone, hoping against hope for a signal this close to the spring. Nothing. He was still too far from civilization, too deep in the desert's empty heart. He would have to wait until he returned home to call Maria, to ask the questions burning in his mind. But standing here with Hope, wearing Sarah's bandana and Sarah's bell, Tom felt his wife's presence so strongly it was almost physical. This wasn't coincidence. This was love, reaching across. Death. Friendship, honoring a dying woman's wishes. Two women who'd understood that Tom would need this, need Hope's companionship, need the mystery to solve, need a reason to keep living beyond his own grief. She planned this, Tom said to Hope, stroking the donkey's dusty neck. Didn't she? Sarah and Maria, they set this up. Made sure you'd be here when I needed you most. Hope nuzzled his hand, her dark eyes holding depths of understanding that seemed impossible for an animal, yet undeniably present. Tom thought of all the days since Sarah's death, the emptiness and isolation, the way he'd shut everyone out and wallowed in his pain. And he thought of these past few days with Hope, how her simple presence had opened something inside him, made him remember how to care, how to connect, how to feel something beyond grief. The sun climbed higher, warming the desert, bringing life to the spring-fed grasses and wildflowers that bloomed after yesterday's rain. Tom decided he would wait. One more day before scattering the ashes. He needed to understand fully, to piece together the gift Sarah had left him, to honor not just her death, but the love that had prompted this elaborate act of care. He spent the day at the spring with Hope, talking to her as he'd talked to Sarah, sharing memories and thoughts, and the slowly growing sense that life might be possible again. The donkey listened with patient attention, occasionally responding with small sounds or gestures that seemed timed perfectly to his emotional needs. As evening approached, Tom sat on the rocks where he and Sarah had sat 40 years ago, Hope beside him, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow he would scatter the ashes. Tomorrow he would say his goodbye. But tonight he felt less alone than he had in months, surrounded by evidence of love that persisted beyond death, held in the presence of an animal who'd been sent to guide him through the darkest journey of his life. The seventh morning arrived with a clarity Tom hadn't felt since before Sarah's death. He woke, knowing this was the day he would finally complete his promise, scatter her ashes at the spring where their love had begun, and say the goodbye he'd been avoiding for 6 months. But first, he needed to check Hope's gear one more time. The mystery of her appearance still nagged at him, and some instinct told him he hadn't found all the clues yet. Sarah had been thorough in everything she did. If she'd planned this, she would have left more than just a bandana and a bell. Tom knelt beside Hope as she grazed near the spring, running his hands carefully over every inch of her halter. The leather was supple despite its age, and as his fingers worked around the brass fittings, he felt something he'd missed before a small, laminated tag clipped to a ring on the side of the halter, hidden beneath the bulk of Hope's thick mane. He worked it free and held it up to the morning light. It was a veterinary examination tag, the kind clinics attach to animals after checkups. The laminated surface was scratched, but still readable, and what Tom saw made his breath catch. Desert Rose Animal Rescue, Boulder City, Nevada. An examination date from 2 weeks ago, less than a week before Tom had left on this journey. Vaccination records showing Hope was current on all shots. A clean bill of health, signed by a veterinarian Tom didn't recognize. And at the bottom, in small print, a note about the animal's disposition: gentle, well-trained, suitable for companionship work. Tom's hands shook as he turned the tag over. On the back, in handwriting he didn't immediately recognize but felt was somehow familiar, were 2 lines. For Tom Jessup's journey, she wanted this. M. Torres. The world seemed to tilt. Tom sat down hard on the ground, the tag clutched in his fist, his mind reeling. Maria Torres, Sarah's best friend. The woman who'd run the rescue with Sarah for 15 years, who'd been there through the illness, who'd tried to help Tom after the funeral when he'd been too lost in grief to accept any comfort. Maria had kept hope. Maria had cared for Sarah's last rescue for all these months. And Maria had orchestrated this, had somehow known Tom was making this journey, and had arranged for Hope to be here, to follow him, to provide the companionship Sarah couldn't. But how? Tom tried to piece it together through the fog of shock. He'd told no one about his plans to scatter the ashes. He'd left quietly, early one morning, without informing any neighbors or friends. How could Maria have known? Then he remembered Maria had visited the week before he left. She'd shown up unannounced one afternoon, bringing food and concern. Tom had been standoffish, as he'd been with everyone, not wanting company or sympathy. They'd talked briefly on the porch, and Maria had spoken about Sarah, about closure, about the importance of honoring promises and finding peace. She'd asked if he was doing all right, if he needed anything. Tom had deflected, made non-committal sounds, eager for her to leave so he could return to his isolated grief. But Maria had always been perceptive, had known Sarah better than anyone except Tom. She must have guessed what he was planning. Must have read the signs in his distracted answers, his restless energy, the way he'd kept glancing toward the mountains, and she'd prepared. She'd taken Hope healthy, trained, ready, and somehow tracked Tom's route. The veterinary tag was dated 2 weeks ago, meaning Maria had started planning this well before Tom left. She must have used the GPS tracker. Sarah had always insisted they keep in their saddles for safety. Sarah had bought matching ones years ago after a neighbor got lost in the backcountry. Tom's would have been transmitting his location the entire journey, and Maria would have known exactly where he was, exactly when to release. Hope so the donkey would intercept to him. The realization broke over Tom in waves, the planning required, the care, the attention to detail. Maria had kept Hope healthy and happy for 6 months, while Tom grieved in isolation. She'd trained the donkey, prepared her for a desert journey, timed everything perfectly. She'd orchestrated an elaborate gift on behalf of a dying woman, honoring Sarah's final wishes, even though Tom had shut her out. Tom felt shame wash through him. Maria had been trying to help all along, and he'd rejected her offers, her friendship, her attempts to honor Sarah's memory. He'd been so wrapped up in his own pain that he'd failed to see the love and loyalty being offered, the way Sarah's friends were trying to carry out her final acts of care. She knew. Tom whispered to Hope, tears streaming down his face. Sarah knew I'd try to do this alone, knew I'd shut everyone out, so she made sure you'd be here. Made sure I wouldn't have to face this moment completely by myself. Hope stood close, her presence solid and comforting, and Tom finally understood the full scope of what Sarah and Maria had done. This wasn't just about providing companionship on a lonely journey. It was about forcing Tom to care for something outside himself, to connect with another living being, to remember what it felt like to be responsible for and responsive to another creature's needs. It was about giving him a reason to keep going, to stay present, to move through grief instead of drowning in it. Every time he'd shared water with Hope, every time he'd checked on her during the hot days, every time he'd talked to her about Sarah and his memories, all of it had been pulling him slowly out of the isolation he'd built around himself. Hope hadn't just been following him, she'd been leading him back to life, back to connection, back to the ability to love and be loved. Tom looked at the copper urn in his saddlebag, at the spring where he and Sarah had met 40 years ago, at Hope standing patiently beside him. The journey suddenly made sense in a way it hadn't before. Sarah hadn't just asked him to scatter her ashes. She'd created one final experience. They could share a journey through the desert with an animal who needed him, who would remind him of all the rescue work they'd done together, who would demonstrate that love and care and connection could continue even after death. He stood slowly, the veterinary tag still in his hand, and walked to Copper's saddle. He pulled out his satellite phone. He'd brought it for emergencies, but hadn't turned it on, wanting to be truly alone. Now he powered it up, waiting for it to find a signal. It took several minutes, but finally the phone connected. Tom dialed Maria's number from memory, his heart pounding. It rang 3 times before she answered, her voice cautious. "Tom? Maria." His voice cracked on her name. "I found your note. On Hope's tag." There was a long silence, then Maria spoke carefully. "Are you angry?" "No." Tom's voice broke completely. "I'm grateful. I'm so grateful I don't have words for it." Maria's breath released in a rush. "Sarah made me promise. In the hospital, near the end. She said you'd try to make the journey alone, said you'd shut everyone out. She asked me to keep hope, to make sure," her voice caught, "to make sure you weren't alone for this. How did you know when I'd go? How did you find me? The GPS tracker in your saddle. Sarah always insisted you carry it. I've been monitoring it since she died, waiting for you to head toward the spring. When you finally left last week, I drove out to the last road access point and released Hope. She was trained to follow a human and stay close, but not crowd. I just had to trust she'd find you and do what Sarah believed. She would give you a reason to care, to stay present, to keep living." Tom closed his eyes, overwhelmed. "She's been perfect. She's been exactly what I needed." "Good." Maria's voice was thick with emotion. "Sarah loved you so much, Tom. Everything she did was about making sure you'd be okay after she was gone." They talked for 20 minutes, Maria explaining the training process, how she'd worked with Hope every day, how Sarah had written detailed instructions before she died about what the donkey should learn, how she should behave. Maria described the veterinary visits, the careful planning of Hope's release, the worry that something might go wrong, that Hope might get lost, or that Tom might reject her. "I wanted to tell you before you left," Maria admitted. "But Sarah said you had to discover it yourself, had to choose to let Hope in, had to open your heart without knowing why. She said, if you knew it was planned, you might resist it out of pride or grief." "She was right," Tom said quietly. "If I'd known, I wouldn't have accepted it. I needed to think it was chance, needed to choose to care for Hope without understanding the gift I was being given." Before hanging up, Tom made. Maria promised to meet him when he returned to the ranch. They had things to discuss about reopening the rescue, about honoring Sarah's memory properly, about moving forward together instead of him facing everything alone. As he ended the call, Tom felt lighter than he had in months. The mystery was solved, the gift understood, and the path forward clearer. He looked at Hope with new eyes, seeing not just a donkey, but Sarah's love made tangible, Maria's friendship honored, and his own future represented in the patient, gentle animal who'd walked beside him through his darkest journey. Tomorrow he would scatter the ashes. But today he would sit with Hope at the spring and feel grateful for Sarah's foresight, for Maria's loyalty, for Hope's presence, and for the possibility of healing he'd thought was lost forever. The afternoon sun hung high above the spring as Tom sat on the rocks where he and Sarah had first spoken 40 years ago. The desert stretched around him in its ancient patience, unchanged by human joy or sorrow, indifferent to the stories played out across its face, yet somehow holding space for all of them. Hope grazed nearby, content in the shade of a cottonwood tree, her presence a comfort Tom no longer questioned or resisted. He'd accepted the gift Sarah and Maria had given him, understood now that he wasn't meant to face this moment alone, that isolation had never been the answer to grief. Tom held the copper urn in his lap, feeling its weight, thinking about all it contained and represented. 40 years of marriage, of love, of shared dreams and quiet mornings, and hard work and laughter. All reduced to ashes and memory, yet somehow still present in the way the sunlight caught the urn's surface, in the warmth of Hope's companionship, in the beauty of this place where everything had begun. He wasn't ready yet. Tom knew himself well enough to recognize the resistance still coiled in his chest. Speaking to Maria had helped. Understanding Sarah's gift had eased something inside him, but the final step, actually releasing the ashes, actually saying goodbye, felt impossibly hard. "I don't know if I can do this," he said aloud, his voice carrying across the still water. "I don't know how to let you go." Hope raised her head from grazing, her ears turning toward him, and Tom felt the familiar comfort of being heard, even if not understood in the way humans understood. The donkey walked over and stood beside him, close enough that he could feel her warmth. Tom set the urn down carefully and reached for his saddlebag, thinking he might look through the photo album again, remind himself of happier times. But as he pulled the bag open, he noticed something he'd somehow missed before a sealed envelope tucked into the pocket of the urn's carrying case. His name was written on it in Sarah's familiar handwriting, the letters slightly shaky in a way that told him she'd written this near the end, when her hands had trembled. From weakness and medication, Tom's heart began pounding. Another gift, another message from beyond death. He held the envelope for a long moment before opening it, afraid of what it might say, afraid of the emotions it would unleash, but knowing he had to read it. The paper inside was from Sarah's personal stationery, the kind she'd used for important letters. Her handwriting covered both sides, cramped and uneven but still legible. Tom began reading, and immediately tears blurred his vision. "My dearest Tom," it began, "if you're reading this, you've finally made the journey to our spring. I've been worried you'd put it off forever, so I asked Maria to help make sure you had a reason to go. I hope you're not angry about Hope. I hope you understand why I did it. You're probably wondering why I'm writing this now, when we still have days or weeks left together. The truth is, I need to say some things while I still have the strength and clarity to say them properly. Soon the medication will cloud everything, and I want you to have these words exactly as I mean them. Tom, you gave me the best life. Every single day with you was a gift. I know you think you should have done more during my illness, been stronger, been more present. I can see the guilt in your eyes even now. Please let that go. You were exactly what I needed, steady and strong, and there when it mattered most. The moments you think you failed are the moments I remember most tenderly, because they showed me how deeply you love, how much my suffering hurt you. I'm not afraid of dying. I've had a good life, a full life, and I'm ready for whatever comes next. But I am afraid for you, afraid of what my death will do to you. I know how you retreat when you're hurt, how you build walls and push people away. I know you'll want to face this grief alone, to carry it by yourself like you've carried every burden we've faced together. Please don't do that. Please let people help you. Maria, especially, she's your friend too, not just mine, and she'll know what you need even when you can't ask for it. I saved one more animal before I got too sick to work. A little donkey we named Hope. I've asked Maria to keep her safe until you're ready to make this journey, and then to make sure Hope finds you. Let her help you heal, Tom. Let yourself care for something again. I know it will feel easier to shut down, to stop caring because caring hurts, but that's not living. That's just existing, and I need you to live for both of us now. When you scatter my ashes at our spring, don't think of it as an ending. Think of it as me returning to the place where I first knew I'd found my person, my home, my heart. That spring gave me you, and that was the greatest gift of my life. Let it be a beginning for you, not an end. Let it be the place where you start living again, where you open your heart to possibility and connection and all the things that make life worth living. I don't expect you to stop grieving. I don't expect you to forget me or move on like I never existed. But I do expect you to keep the rescue going if you can. Those animals need someone with patience and kindness, and you have both in abundance, even if you don't think you do. I've seen you with them, seen how gentle you are, how much you care even when you pretend you don't. Work with Maria. She knows how to run the operation, and she'd be honored to do it in my memory. Together, you can help so many creatures who desperately need what we were able to give them: safety, care, a second chance at a good life. Tom, I need you to promise me something. Promise you won't scatter my ashes and then ride back to an empty ranch and close yourself off from the world. Promise you'll go home and call Maria, reopen the rescue, fill those empty corrals with animals who need you. Promise you'll keep living, keep connecting, keep being the man I fell in love with 40 years ago when I saw you at this spring and knew immediately that you were kind and good and true. You showed me how to be loved well. You worked hard for us, provided for us, stood by me through every challenge and triumph. You made me feel safe and cherished and valued every single day. Now I need you to do something harder. I need you to let yourself be loved by the people who care about you, to accept help and comfort and connection, even when it feels uncomfortable. Don't be alone, my love. Don't shut yourself away in grief and think that's honoring my memory. Honor me by living fully, by helping others, by finding moments of joy and peace, and maybe even laughter again. I want you to be happy, Tom. Not right away. Grief takes time, and you should take all the time you need. But eventually, I want you to find happiness again. Hope will help. She's special, that one. I've spent hours with her, teaching her to be patient and gentle, to be the kind of companion someone needs when they're hurting. She'll know what to do even when you don't. Trust her instincts. Let her in. I'm so tired now. The pain is getting harder to manage, and the medication makes it difficult to hold a pen. But I needed to write this. Needed you to know how much you meant to me, how grateful I am for our years together, how proud I am of the man you are. When you stand at the spring and release my ashes, know that I'm proud of you for making the journey. Know that I'm not really gone. I'm in every animal we saved, every fence you built, every morning coffee we shared, every sunset we watched together. I'm in Hope's patient eyes, and Maria's loyal friendship, and the desert wind that carried us both to that spring 40 years ago. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for being my partner, my friend, my home. Thank you for making my life everything I hoped it would be. Don't scatter my ashes and leave, Tom. Scatter them and begin again. All my love, always. Sarah. Tom read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face, each reading revealing new layers of meaning and love. Sarah had known him so completely, had understood exactly what he would need to hear, had tried even in her final days to care for him, to guide him, to give him permission to keep living. The guilt he'd been carrying for 6 months, the belief that he'd failed her during her illness, that he should have been stronger, more present, less afraid, dissolved under the weight of her words. She hadn't needed him to be perfect. She just needed him to be there, and he had been. Every difficult day, every painful treatment, every moment of fear and weakness, he'd been there. That was enough. She'd told him it was enough. Tom folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. He stood, holding the urn again, and walked to the water's edge. Hope followed, standing beside him, and Tom felt Sarah's presence so strongly it was almost physical in the warmth of the sun, the sound of water moving over stone, the gentle pressure of Hope's head against his arm. I understand now. Tom said aloud, speaking to Sarah though she couldn't hear, speaking to the desert and the sky and the ancient spring that had brought them together. I understand what you wanted me to learn. You knew I couldn't heal by myself, knew I needed a reason to care, needed hope to remind me how to love and be loved. You knew I'd shut everyone out unless forced to do otherwise. He paused, emotion catching in his throat. You were right, about everything. About me needing help, about the rescue, about living instead of just existing. I'm going to do what you asked. I'm going to keep my promises, all of them. Not just scattering your ashes, but the bigger ones too. I'm going to reopen the rescue with Maria. I'm going to take care of Hope. I'm going to keep living for both of us. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, identical to the sunset on that evening. 40 years ago, Tom knew the time had come. He couldn't delay any longer, and truthfully, he didn't want to. Sarah's letter had given him what he needed: permission, understanding, and a path forward. He opened the urn carefully, respectfully, prepared for the final goodbye and the new beginning it would represent. Hope stood beside him, faithful presence and living reminder of Sarah's love, and together they faced the place where 40 years of love had begun, ready to honor its end and embrace its transformation into something new. Tom stood at the water's edge, the copper urn open in his hands, and began to speak. The words came easier than he'd expected, flowing from a place of love rather than pain, gratitude rather than grief. Sarah, I'm here like I promised. I know it took me 6 months, and I know you probably worried I'd never come, but Hope helped me find the way. She did exactly what you trained her to do. She reminded me how to care, how to connect, how to keep. Living even when it hurt. He paused, watching the water ripple and flow, unchanged by centuries, indifferent to human joy or sorrow, yet somehow the perfect witness to both. Thank you for 40 years. Thank you for loving me when I was too rough around the edges, for teaching me patience, for making our ranch a home. Thank you for the rescue work, for showing me that kindness matters, that every life has value, that love multiplies when you share it. Tom's voice broke slightly, but he continued. I'm sorry I wasn't perfect during your illness. I'm sorry I was scared and sometimes distant when the fear got too big. But I'm letting that guilt go now, like you asked. You said I was enough, and I'm choosing to believe you. He looked down at the ashes, grey-white and surprisingly heavy in their concentration. Each handful represented moments of their life together, wedding vows and morning coffee, hard winters and good harvests, quiet evenings and shared dreams. I promise I'm going to do what you asked. I'm going to reopen the rescue with Maria. I'm going to take care of Hope. I'm going to live, not just exist. I'm going to honor your memory by helping others, by staying open, by finding joy again when I'm ready. Tom waded into the shallow water, feeling the cold shock of it against his legs, moving to the exact spot where he'd first seen Sarah 40 years ago. The light was perfect, just as it had been that evening, golden and warm, painting everything with a gentle glow that made the world feel sacred. He began releasing the ashes, handful by handful, watching them settle on the water's surface. Some floated, catching the light like tiny stars. Some sank immediately, becoming part of the spring's depths. Others drifted on the current, moving downstream, spreading wide across the landscape Sarah had loved. With each release, Tom spoke a memory aloud. Remember teaching me to dance in the kitchen? You were patient, even though I stepped on your feet. 100 times. More ashes to the water. Remember the year we drove to the coast and saw the ocean together? You laughed when waves knocked us down. Another handful. Remember all the animals we saved together? Every single one mattered to you. The urn grew lighter as Tom continued, each memory a gift he gave back to the desert, to the spring, to the air and water and earth that had borne witness to their love. He spoke of laughter and arguments, triumphs and failures, ordinary days and extraordinary moments. He released it all into the water, watching Sarah return to the place where their story had begun. When the urn was finally empty, Tom stood in the water as the sun moved lower in the sky. He felt different, lighter somehow, as if releasing the ashes had also released some of the weight he'd been carrying. The grief remained, would always remain, but it no longer felt crushing. It felt manageable, something he could carry and live with rather than something that buried him. He waded back to shore, where Hope waited patiently. Tom set the empty urn on the rocks and reached out to stroke Hope's neck, grateful for her presence, for the companionship that had made this journey bearable. As his hand moved along Hope's neck toward her ears, his fingers brushed something he'd somehow never noticed before. He pushed aside the thick mane and stared in shock at what he saw. There, behind Hope's left ear, was a small brand mark, faint but unmistakable. A perfect heart shape, no bigger than Tom's thumbnail, the edges clean and healed long ago. Tom's hands began to shake. He knew that brand. Sarah had used it on every animal she rescued, marking them as saved and loved and valued. It was her signature, her promise to each creature that they mattered, that they'd been chosen for care and protection. He traced the heart-shaped brand with his finger, understanding flooding through him. Hope wasn't just some random donkey Maria had trained to follow him. Hope was Sarah's last official rescue, marked with Sarah's brand, claimed and loved in Sarah's final act of compassion before illness had stolen her strength. "You're one of hers?" Tom whispered, his voice breaking. "Really, truly one of hers. She marked you. She claimed you as family. The brand meant everything. It meant Sarah had looked at this donkey and decided she was worth saving, worth protecting, worth marking permanently as rescued and loved. And then Sarah had asked Maria to train Hope for this specific purpose, to accompany Tom on his hardest journey, to be the living embodiment of Sarah's care, extending beyond death. Tom knelt in the sand beside Hope, overwhelmed by the completeness of Sarah's gift. Not just companionship, not just a distraction from grief, but a creature Sarah herself had chosen and marked and loved. Hope carried Sarah's brand, Sarah's training, Sarah's intention to heal and help and guide. Tom wrapped his arms around Hope's neck and cried, not the desperate, drowning sobs of early grief, but cleaner tears of gratitude and recognition and acceptance. Sarah's love had reached across death to touch him, to guide him, to bring him to this moment of understanding and release. Hope stood steady and patient, bearing witness to Tom's breaking open, to the grief finally flowing free, to the healing that could only come through, feeling everything fully rather than holding it back. The desert held them both as the sun continued its descent, painting the sky in colors of fire and gold, and Tom finally let himself grieve properly, completely, with gratitude for what had been and hope for what might still be. Tom and Hope stayed at the spring through the afternoon, neither needing to move, both content in the stillness that follows a storm. Tom felt wrung out but clean, like the desert after yesterday's rain, washed and renewed, ready for what might grow next. He made coffee as the shadows lengthened, sitting on the rocks with Hope. Beside him, watching the water flow over stone worn smooth by time. The ashes had dispersed now, some settled into the spring's depths, some carried downstream, some caught in the grass along the banks. Sarah was part of this place now, returned to where their story had begun, her physical presence transformed into something larger and less defined, but no less real. Tom thought about the future for the first time in months, not with dread or emptiness, but with cautious possibility. He thought about the empty ranch waiting for him, the barn that could be filled again with animals who needed help. He thought about Maria and the partnership they could build, honoring Sarah's memory through action rather than isolation. He thought about Hope and the commitment he was ready to make. His eyes fell on the frayed lead rope still attached to Hope's halter. It was worn nearly through in places, a testament to however many days Hope had worn it while following him across the desert. Tom examined it closely. It would hold for the journey home, but not much beyond that. It needed replacing. Tom walked to Copper's saddle and pulled out his emergency supply kit. He'd packed leather strips for repairs, a habit born from years of ranch work where something always needed fixing. He pulled out several strips, testing their strength, selecting the best ones. Sitting cross-legged on the ground, with Hope standing patiently before him, Tom began braiding a new lead rope. His hands knew the work. He'd made countless halters and leads over the years, the pattern so ingrained he barely had to think about it. But this rope felt different, more significant. Each twist of leather represented a choice, a commitment, a promise. As he worked, Tom spoke aloud, testing the words he needed to say. "If you'll have me, Hope, you've got a home, always. Not because Sarah asked me to take care of you, though she did, but because I want to. Because you helped me when I needed it most. And now I want to return that gift." Hope's ears swiveled toward him, listening, and Tom continued braiding, finding the right rhythm. "We'll go back to the ranch together. Reopen the rescue. Maria will help. She's good at this, better than I am in some ways. But I'll do my part. Feed you every day, make sure you're healthy, give you purpose." The braid grew longer, stronger. Tom worked with care, making sure each knot was tight, each twist secure. This rope would last years if properly maintained. This rope would be Hope's connection to home, to safety, to the life they'd build together. "You're not just Sarah's last rescue anymore," Tom said, finishing the final section of braid. "You're the first rescue of whatever comes next. The beginning of a new chapter, not just the end of an old one." He tied the rope securely to Hope's halter, removing the old, frayed one and setting it aside. He would keep the old rope. It represented the journey they'd shared, the path that had brought them both to this moment. But the new rope represented the future, the choice to move forward, the commitment to continue. Tom stood and cupped Hope's face in his hands, looking into her dark, intelligent eyes. "She knew what she was doing when she marked you with that heart. She was telling me you were worth saving, worth protecting, worth loving. And she was right." Hope leaned into his touch, and Tom felt something shift deep in his chest, not the sharp pain of grief, but something gentler and warmer. Not replacement of Sarah, but addition to his capacity to love, not forgetting, but expanding. There was room in his heart for both the past he honored and the future he was ready to begin. The sun touched the horizon, flooding the desert with golden light, identical to that evening 40 years ago. Tom mounted Copper and gathered Hope's new lead rope in his hand. It felt right, the weight of it, the purpose behind it, the commitment it represented. "Time to go home," he said to Hope, and the words felt true in a way they hadn't before. Not back to emptiness and grief, but home to possibility and purpose, home to a barn that would fill with animals again, home to a life that would honor Sarah through action rather than isolation. They left the spring as the last light faded, Tom on Copper with Hope following on her new rope, connected now not by accident or orchestration but by choice and commitment. Behind them, the spring held Sarah's ashes and the memory of 40 years of love. Ahead, the desert stretched toward a future Tom was finally ready to face. The journey had transformed from farewell to beginning, from ending to continuation. Tom carried Sarah's memory in his heart, her compass in his pocket, her letter in his saddlebag, and her last rescue beside him. He was no longer the man who'd ridden into the desert alone 6 days ago, broken and lost. He was someone who'd learned to accept help, to embrace connection, to believe that life could still hold purpose and meaning and even joy. Hope walked steadily beside Copper, her bell chiming softly with each step, marking their progress home. And Tom, for the first time in 6 months, felt ready for whatever came next. 3 weeks after Tom Jessup returned from the Mojave Desert, the ranch was alive again. The morning sun painted the barn in warm gold as Tom stood in the doorway, watching Hope settle into her stall. She'd claimed the corner stall nearest the entrance, where she could see everything happening in the barn and the yard beyond. It was the same stall Sarah's favorite horse had occupied years ago, and Tom found comfort in the continuity. The transformation had been swift, once Tom committed to it. The day after he'd returned, He'd called Maria, and they'd talked for 3 hours about Sarah, about hope, about the rescue work they could do together. Maria had cried with relief when Tom explained how the journey had changed him, how ready he was to honor Sarah's wishes by reopening the operation. They'd spent the past weeks repairing fences, cleaning stalls, organizing supplies, and spreading word through the rescue network that they were accepting animals again. The response had been immediate. Shelters and individuals contacted them about horses that needed rehoming, donkeys facing euthanasia, dogs abandoned at kill shelters. There was never a shortage of animals who needed help, only a shortage of people willing to provide it. Today, their first new rescue was arriving, a young donkey, seized from a neglect case, underfed and frightened, but healthy enough to recover with proper care. Maria had made the arrangements, coordinating with animal control, ensuring they had everything needed for the animal's arrival. Tom had prepared a stall next to Hope's, stocking it with fresh hay and water, hanging a nameplate that simply said, "New Beginning." They'd change it once the donkey settled in and showed its personality, let the animal tell them who it was. Too meant to be. Hope watched from her stall as Tom made final preparations, her eyes bright with interest. She'd thrived in the past weeks, filling out on regular feed and rest, her coat gleaming from daily brushing, her hooves trimmed and healthy. But more than physical changes, Tom saw something else in Hope, a contentment, a sense of purpose. She seemed to understand that she was home, that her job as Tom's companion on that desert journey was complete, and now she had a new role, welcoming other rescues, showing them by example that safety and care were possible. A truck rumbled up the drive, Maria, arriving with the new donkey in a small trailer. Tom walked out to meet her, Hope following partway before stopping at the fence line, watching with patient curiosity. Maria climbed out of the truck, her face showing a mix of excitement and concern. She was in her early 60s, with grey-streaked black hair and Sarah's same warm smile. Over the past weeks, Tom had remembered why. Sarah had loved her so much. Maria was steady and competent, with a deep well of kindness and a practical approach to problem-solving. "Ready?" she asked Tom. "Ready," he confirmed. They opened the trailer together, and Tom got his first look at the young donkey. She was small, probably less than 2 years old, with a dull brown coat and visible ribs beneath the skin. Her eyes were wide with fear, her ears flat against her head. She trembled as Maria carefully led her down the ramp. Tom's heart ached seeing her distress, but he also felt something else: purpose. This was what Sarah had done for years, what she'd taught him was possible. Take frightened, damaged creatures and show them that humans could be kind, that life could be safe, that trust could be earned slowly and carefully. "Easy, girl," Tom said softly, keeping his distance, letting the donkey process the new environment without pressure. "Nobody's going to hurt you here. You're safe now." They led the donkey into the barn, into the prepared stall. She huddled in the corner initially, but as Tom and Maria backed away, giving her space, the donkey began exploring cautiously. She sniffed the hay, drank deeply from the water bucket, investigated every corner of her new home. Hope made a soft sound from the next stall, not quite a bray, more like a gentle greeting. The young donkey's ears pricked forward with interest. She moved to the shared wall between stalls, and the two donkeys touched noses through the bars, Hope patient and calm, the newcomer nervous but curious. Tom watched the interaction with wonder. Hope was doing exactly what Sarah would have done, offering presence without pressure, showing by example that this place was safe, that these humans could be trusted. Maria stood beside Tom, and he felt her hand squeeze his shoulder. "Sarah would be so proud of you," she said quietly. "This is what she wanted for the work to continue, for you to find purpose again. I couldn't do it without you," Tom replied honestly. "I was so lost, Maria. I pushed everyone away, including you, and I'm sorry for that. You were grieving. There's no wrong way to grieve, Tom. And you found your way through it. That's what matters." They stood together watching the donkeys interact, and Tom felt Sarah's presence in the moment, not as loss or absence, but as continuation. This work they were doing was Sarah's work, her legacy made tangible. Every animal they saved would be a testament to her belief that every creature deserved kindness, that compassion could heal what cruelty had broken. After Maria left, Tom spent the afternoon working in the barn, letting the young donkey grow accustomed to his presence. He moved slowly, spoke softly, made no demands. He'd learned from Sarah that trust couldn't be forced, only offered and accepted in its own time. As evening approached, Tom leaned against Hope's stall and pulled Sarah's wedding ring from his pocket. He'd carried it every day, since the desert, but now he walked to the shelf above Hope's stall and placed it there deliberately, right where he could see it every morning when he came to feed her, right where it could watch over the work they were doing. "I'm keeping my promises," he said aloud, not sure if he was speaking to Sarah, to Hope, or to himself. "All of them. The rescue is open again. I'm working with Maria. I'm taking care of Hope. And I'm living, not just existing." Hope turned her large eyes toward him, and in their depths Tom saw understanding, patience, and something that might have been approval. The new donkey was settling in her stall, no longer trembling, cautiously eating hay. Tom filled water buckets, distributed evening feed, checked latches and gates with practiced efficiency. The routines of ranch life had become meaningful again, each task serving a purpose beyond just filling time. He was caring for creatures who needed him, honoring Sarah's memory through action, building a future that held both grief and possibility in equal measure. As he closed the barn for the night, Tom looked back at the stalls, Hope watching him with calm affection, the new donkey finding safety in her corner. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and rewards. There would be more animals to help, more hearts to heal, more reasons to stay present and engaged with life. Tom walked to the house under a sky brilliant with stars, feeling the weight of Sarah's compass in his pocket, carrying the memory of her letter in his heart. He was 64 years old, a widower, a rancher, and now a rescuer of animals who needed second chances. It wasn't the life he'd imagined 6 months ago, but it was a life worth living. He turned once at the door, looking back at the barn where Hope settled in for the night, her bell chiming softly as she moved. "Thank you," he whispered into the desert wind. "Thank you for everything, for Hope, for this, for showing me the way forward." The wind carried his textions, words away across the darkening desert, toward the spring where Sarah's ashes rested, toward the past they'd shared and the future he was building. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Tom Jessup felt something close to peace. Tomorrow he would wake and feed the animals and continue the work. Tomorrow Maria would visit and they would plan for the next rescue. Tomorrow, Hope would greet him with patient affection and show the new donkey that trust was possible. Tomorrow held possibility. And that, Tom realized, was exactly what Sarah had wanted for him, not to forget her or move on as if she'd never existed, but to carry her love forward into a life that still held meaning, purpose, and the simple, profound gift of caring for creatures who needed kindness. He went inside and closed the door, ready for whatever came next.